on commitment savings accounts. I will try to focus on a couple at the end that are newer results, one from Latin America, one from Bolivia. But the presentation will be a little bit different style than the other presentations you've heard so far, in that it's I'm not presenting to you on one study, but more on a series of studies that have a similar theme to them, and how we're piecing them together to both try to understand something more about how to design savings products that work across many different contexts. And also I'm presenting it to you with a mindset to hopefully whet your appetite. We are now looking, I think some of the lessons that we're going to learn are ready for action, hence the action part of the name of Innovations for Poverty Action. And so it's not to say that we think as researchers, I'm not proposing I quit my day job as a researcher, but there are a lot of ideas here that are ready to be taken to scale with banks and financial institutions, and so we are keen to do that. So the rough overview, what I'm going to talk about is, first I'm going to give you an overview of what these are and what the theory is behind them in terms of individual decision making that makes them different than a normal savings account. Then I will talk about design and how we test them, as well as then presenting you results from around the world. So this comes from an old story from from Odysseus, and it's a classic story that we maybe have read in childhood when reading Greek mythology. And the basic idea here is very simple, right? So Odysseus is aware of these beautiful sirens that are going to sing a song that is going to lure him, and all men are unable to resist the temptation of the lure of these sirens. And so, but he wants to hear these sirens. So what he does, in order to make sure that he doesn't steer the ship off into the rocks and crash, which is what would happen if he was unconstrained, is he ties himself to the mast. Hence the picture of him tying himself to the mast. And then he can listen to the sirens. And the idea is he restricts his future choices, right? He realizes before he gets to this area that if he is unconstrained in the future, that he will sail the ship over into the sirens to go see them, and then crash. So he restricts his future choices. He makes it so that he can't move the ship, and then he can enjoy the song. And this is, in some sense, the theme behind commitment savings, is we all recognize that we have different temptations that we're going to experience in the future in our life. And yet, so what we want to do is set ourselves up so that the price of our vice is more expensive. The price of our vice goes up. So maybe our vice is spending on frivolous things. Maybe our vice is actually not about us, but it might be about our spouse, right? Maybe we're perfectly controlled in how we allocate our money and manage our budget, but we know that if we have too much money available, that our spouse is going to go do things that we don't want them to do. And so that's the key of the basic idea behind any sort of commitment is, ironically, about restricting future choices, right? And that's one of the themes of commitment savings, and also transcends to other facets of life that we have done research on, about commitments to not smoke, commitments to lose weight, things like that. So what I've just talked about is commitment, just very simply defined as a voluntary restriction of your own future choices. And what I've just told you with the story about Odysseus is a story of time inconsistency, and why people might engage and have a preference to restrict their future choices, because they realize that I might say right now that I don't want the dessert, but when it comes time to actually ordering dessert, I'm going to succumb to the temptation. I might say now that I don't want to spend money on certain items that I don't really need, but when it comes time to make that decision, I get very tempted by the new shoes or the new something, and then I end up with not enough money to do long-term savings for retirement or things of this nature, or investments in fertilizer. So that's all what we mean by time inconsistency. A second story, though, that also implies a need for commitment accounts is when you just simply have a lack of discipline or habit or attention. And a commitment account, if you know that you have a certain attention issue, and you just might forget to do something, that's not the same thing as being tempted. It's just saying that you forgot. And so an account which commits you to deposit money every so often on a regular basis is a commitment account that it's not that you are going to be wowed by temptation, but it's just that you need something to give you that structure in life to make sure that you do it. And that's a commitment account can provide that often. The household bargaining is the issue I mentioned earlier, and that's another theory in terms of household bargaining problems that implies that commitment accounts might be better than regular accounts. So what do we mean by commitment accounts? What we mean is there's a few different dimensions over which when we talk about a commitment account, but the general principle is that it in some way is restricting your future or restricting your future choices. So first of all, think about it in two sides of the transaction, right? What are the two things we do with savings accounts? We deposit and we withdraw. So a commitment account can work on either side. A commitment account can be a commitment to make deposits, or a commitment account can be a commitment to not withdraw the money. And we've seen them both ways, and depending on the context, we might make arguments. And that's one of the areas that I think that I'm going to get to at the end that I think needs further work, is understanding exactly how to structure these types of things. So that's the middle. The first is, when we say restricting your future choices, how high do we mean that to be? How much have we changed our future choices? So think about it this way. Suppose we have an account that says it's a restriction to not withdraw your money, and the rule is under no circumstances can you withdraw your money, period. That's it, no exceptions. That's a really strict commitment account. Imagine a weaker one would say, pay $5 and you can make a withdrawal. Well, that's a weaker. It's still changing your future choices in that you can no longer withdraw it for free. It's making it so it's a little costly, but it's not quite as costly as saying you just can never do it. And so there's a spectrum there, and it's not always monetary. So one of the studies that I'm going to show you later on, when I get to some of the results, the cost of reneging is simply psychological. It's giving people an account in which they've made personal commitments to do something, and then deviation from that has psychic costs to individuals, in the sense that deviating, they then might feel bad about themselves, and in anticipation of that feeling, they stay on track. The third element has to do with automation of deposits, which I think is an important element that we're seeing a lot of exploration on. That's very important, and that's a different. It's kind of part of. I could have put this as a subunit under 2, as in a commitment to deposit, but the point here is that there's many situations in which if you can automate deposits, it's clearly going to be better than requiring positive action every time from someone to take the steps to save. In many contexts in developing countries, that's not an option. We're seeing as we see mobile money take off, that becomes more and more of an option in many settings. So as one kind of summary point to that to make is, in the United States, we do work on helping people save as well. There's a lot of what people perceive as undersaving. And there, more often than not, the goal is to get people's attention away from saving. Because the point is, you can do lots of things to get direct deposit out of a paycheck and out of a checking account into a savings account in the United States. And if you can get someone to sign up for that and then forget the fact that they signed up for it, they'll end up accumulating more savings for retirement. On the other hand, when you're dealing with households that are similar to what Abhijit Banerjee was speaking about in the morning, households that are running informal businesses, selling vegetables in a market, well, there's no way to automate that. You want their attention on the savings, so you need to do things that emphasize the attention, and because there's no way of actually automating deposits. The last dimension over which products differ has to do with the way they're marketed, the way we try to generate demand, and the way they try to help people become self-aware. And we might see really big differences in the effectiveness in the outreach and the success of a product that has nothing to do with the kind of the terms and the conditions of that account, but simply has to do with how it's been marketed. And so that's an important feature that we cannot and should not ignore, even though most of what you're hearing talked about is all about products with terms and conditions. Sometimes just how good the marketing material is can make the world of difference. A second theme to all of this that I'll bring out as much as we can, but not all studies are able to do this as well as others, has to do with the impact. And the impact on actual household outcomes, what I mean. A lot of studies, it's much easier to look at administrative data, which is important from the bank's perspective, and it is certainly a process change that is indicative of a lot. But we also, as people who are all here because we care about issues of poverty and issues of social welfare, we want to know what is the causal outcome as a result of this product. Two types of things to ask here. The first is, where does the money come from? Right, this is different than an intervention on education or something like that, because there's an outside input that's being brought in and then has some output to it, right? Or some health intervention, we're providing medicine, and then people get better. But on a savings account, we're offering them the opportunity to move money from one part of their life to another part of their life. So where's the money coming from? If it's coming from other savings, that's not so exciting in many cases. Maybe the other account was kind of just as good. Maybe it's an informal account, so it's less risky. So that, it can be better. It's an improvement in many cases, but we want to understand where it's coming from. It could come from debt. That could be bad. If you're encouraging someone to save more and locking them into a savings pattern, and then as a byproduct of that, they take out more debt, and the debt has a higher interest rate on the debt than they're earning on the savings, well, you just made them worse off. So that's a positive outcome in the sense that you help them mobilize more savings that actually makes them worse off. That's clearly not the direction we want to go, so we need to understand that better. Could come from lower consumption. Maybe it's like what the results that Abhijit presented in the morning with loans, where you see a reduction in the temptation goods, so those go away, and then they're able to save up for something like health or education. That's obviously a nice story. We kind of like to tell those stories. It's not always like that. Lastly, which is the story we really want to tell, is higher income. Right, so they got access to an account that allowed them to accumulate some money, that allowed them to make investments, they made return on those investments, and they put that money back into savings, and all was a nice cycle. And so when we come back at the end of the year, we see higher savings as a result of the higher income. I think it's hard to detect that often in the studies that you see because it requires a lot of data along the way. So the changes for the household are really important. We will look at what is the byproduct of getting access to the savings. Now you have this vehicle that allows you to save up to lumpier things, larger things. Well, where does it go? What are the things that are missing in your life that you now engage in with access to this account? So when we talk about this impact question, about how people's lives have changed, I want to remind us of one theme to all of the research that you're hearing about in these days, which is the impact question, precisely stated, is how have the lives of people using a commitment savings product changed compared to how they would have changed if the program did not exist? Right? It's that second part that's unique about everything that you're hearing in today's conference and tomorrow, which is the ability to attack and get at that second part of that question by using randomized trials, by then using a control group to be able to understand what would have happened had people not gotten access to a commitment account, remittance program, whatever the case may be. So let me tell you now about some studies. So the first one that I was involved in was actually called Tying Odysseus to the Mast, and it was done in the Philippines, and the restriction on the future choice was simple. We just said you cannot access your money until you reach your goal, and that goal was either a date or an amount. There were exceptions for medical. There were exceptions for death, in which case their family could come get their money. And there were exceptions for if they moved outside of the area of the bank. The savings increased by 82%. Females who had access to these accounts spent 20% more on durable goods for the household and ended up with more power over decisions in the household. And one important result was that the individuals who were identified as more impatient now and not so much in the future were the ones who were more likely to take up these accounts. So that's evidence of this time inconsistency theory that I mentioned in the opening being exactly the right type of person who sees the value of this account and it works for them. Because it's not right for everybody. If you have perfect control over your spending and a perfect attention, then why would you want to tie your future self up? So in Malawi, another study done by Javi Junet and others, Javi's here somewhere, did a study in which everybody in the program had already access to a highly liquid account where money from their crops went into the normal bank account. And then half of them were randomly offered a second account that had a commitment feature where the money was locked up until planting season the next season. And this had some really dramatic impacts on the likelihood that they getting access to the second commitment account had huge impacts on the amount that they saved, the amount that they invested 3 or 4 months later in the planting season, and it even led to a 17 percentage point increase in household expenditures, right, which is a huge impact on actually, and that was directly through having higher income. But here was the interesting thing about this. The money didn't actually go into the commitment account. It went into the other account. Right? So it suggests that the psychological barrier, the psychological commitment, was actually really what did the trick. Or at least that's my interpretation of these results. And so the suggestion was very powerful. You need to commit. And so people were willing to commit, but they didn't want to tie their hands up they wanted to tie their hands up with a very loose rope, is another way of thinking about it. So that if there was an emergency, they could still get free, but that if they didn't need to get free, they were still fine and the money was put aside. And so, but it planted this idea in their head, and then that nudged them along to keeping the money, and it had this great effect. So that led us to, that very much is in line with another study. I'm a little out of order here, so I'll skip to here, from Ghana, in which we did something very much like that without the commitment feature. We just labeled the savings accounts. We just gave them an account that had a label to it, and it said, you're just going to put a name on this, health, education, business, or other, and nothing more. Right? So it's still a commitment account in the sense that deviating from your plan has a psychological cost to you of failing to do things you said you would do. Right? And so that is a commitment. It's a very weak one. And yet that alone increased savings by 30% so far. We're now in the field to try to understand more about whether this changes actual expenditures that the household engages in or not. So this study is not out yet. We're still just halfway through, but the results are, as I see them, very consistent with the results from Malawi, which suggest that kind of soft commitments are a good way to go. Another study which also comes out very strongly in favor of soft commitments comes from Uganda. So here we offered children in schools one of two accounts. Well, we didn't give them a choice. It was treatment 1, treatment 2, and control. Treatment 1 was a savings account where money went into the account and then had to be used for educational expenses. Treatment 2, the money had to go into this account, but then when it got pulled out, it didn't have to go for educational expenses. Instead, what would happen is the moment they get the cash, there was literally a table right next to they go to one table, they get their cash, and the next table over, there's somebody selling the things that they need to buy for school, pens, paper, workbooks, things of this nature. Right? The same way it was set up for the people who had to buy it, the difference is in their setup, they went to the desk, they got a voucher, and then they went to the next desk over and spent the voucher. So they were locked in, they had to do it. But in the cash one, they came here and they got cash, and then they could go there, or they could just go home. They didn't have to stop over the next table. Right? So what ended up happening was the kids did not want the vouchers. They didn't want to tie their hands really tightly. So they didn't put them as much money in to those accounts. But when it was just the cash arm, it worked. And they put more money in, and then they bought workbooks and pens and papers, and voila, their test scores actually went up by 8%, which is a huge improvement in test scores simply as a result of getting access to a savings account for children. Okay. So then the Latin American study tells a very different story in the end, well, a mixed story. So first of all, this was done with the Samani tribe in the Amazon. So this is a really rural area of Bolivia. My understanding is that it's about a 6-hour canoe ride from the nearest town where you go. And so unfortunately, I have not made it yet to the field in this one, but the point is it's very, very remote, kind of a hunter-gatherer type of environment. And so we're working with a team of anthropologists who have been working there for a very long time. And we offered people a simple savings account physical box that they could put money in So it's not a formal savings account because there's no way to do that in this type of context, but it's just a box where they can put money aside. So savings increased hugely through this. They really had no other vehicle for any sort of putting money aside other than, this is almost like formalizing what they could anyhow do with a mattress, but it just pushes them and gives them a more formal process for it. So we do see an increase in household durable goods that are bought, like pots and pans and things of this nature. But the other really striking result was on the men. Men drank more. So we're actually back in the field this summer to try to understand this more, but they shifted towards more commercialized alcohol, like alcohol, rather than other types of alcohol. And the actual alcoholic content went up, and blood pressure went up for the men as well. So one takeaway from this, which we're back in the field this summer to do qualitative work to try to understand these results more, but I think one really important lesson from this is just to realize that savings accounts, and credit for that matter too, are agnostic in the way they're, in terms of how they're used. And by agnostic, what I mean is there might be some intention by some institution, we want this to be used for health and education. But at the end of the day, the product is agnostic, and people can use it how they wish. And lots of people can have very different next best alternatives for what they're going to do. And so, someone who gets access to this account is able to save up a lot. It turns out, in this context, for the men, the very next thing that they wanted to spend money on, if they were able to accumulate a little bit, was alcohol. So some of the next steps here. I would put two types of next steps that I think are important to be tackled. One on a theoretical, more academic level, and the second, very practical levels, which are interesting academically as well. The first is about heterogeneity. Right, so why did we get that result in Bolivia and not elsewhere? How much of that was a function of the deeply remote area that we were studying, and so then the lack of things to save up for, in a sense? Right? There were no large durable, there was no enterprise. This is like the epitome of what Abhijit was presenting on in the morning. There is no way anybody is running an enterprise in this area of Bolivia that has room for scale. So what exactly would they save for that's at a large level? And so maybe that's going to drive those results. And then likewise, if that's true, that same pattern should hold within a setting for individuals that have opportunities for large increases in enterprise versus do not. A second has to do with long-term behavior change, particularly when it comes to habit formation. So these commitments to deposit, for instance, how can you actually create a long-term habit or not? Take the children example that I gave you. We're very keen to go back and study and find out whether we have gotten children when they're young into the habit of savings. Will that influence them in 5 or 10 years? Is this one of those classic stories where when you teach someone young to do something, the habit sticks and we change their life for the long run? But old people, it's hard to change us. Maybe we can move you a little bit by using a really tough stick, a big stick, but then once we remove the stick, you're back to your natural being, so to speak. And third issue that I think is really important is how much of the difference in the results that we see across different settings are because of the framing or the psychological effects. So take the Malawi example that I gave you, right? The fact that the money flows to this other account puts really strong suggestion about some of these results being driven by the framing and the psychology that is of being offered an account and how that changes how you think about investments. On a practical level, I think there's two things that are, one that is really exciting and at the same time it's a huge opportunity and risk, which is mobile money. In a very simple nutshell, the best and worst thing to happen for savings is the drop of transaction costs to close to zero. This is amazing and also scary at the same time. It's amazing because, as an economist, anytime we can get transaction costs down, that's a good thing. It means that trades and transactions that weren't otherwise happening that make both parties, buyer and seller, happy are good. So if the buyer and the seller is the person, the individual is trying to put money into a bank account, the bank wants to accept the deposit. We lower the cost of them doing that, everybody's better off. That's great. The downside, of course, though, is if you do have an issue with temptation, making it so that you can get your money like that is actually a problem. So you want to actually have that price higher. So there's a little bit of a tension with things like mobile money with how to strike that right balance. And the second is how we're going to integrate marketing and financial literacy efforts into the scale-up of these types of products is something that I think I'm consistently hear around the world whenever talking with institutions engaged in this. So I will talk more about this tomorrow in the wrap-up session as well, to whet people's appetites further. Some of the big open questions that I think exist in this space, and that we embrace the opportunity to work with everybody here at your respective institutions, and to introduce you to other researchers who are interested in these questions, so that we can help take these ideas and bring them to the world, and bring them to financial institutions, and bring them to people around the world, to help improve the quality of the financial services that we have as kind of wealthy people in this world have grown accustomed to. How can we translate this down to the unbanked and underbanked of the world? So thank you very much, and we'll close up.